Hello and welcome back to the men's haircutting chapter 14 section of your PowerPoint. This is actually going to be part 3, and we appreciate the fact that you were able to join us with part 1 and 2. So we're going to continue with some more terms that are actually listed in your chapter, for chapter 14 in this chapter. So again, make sure that you're studying, make sure that you are using your textbook as a reference to be able to see a lot of these different points that we're talking about. Obviously, these PowerPoints are based specifically off of your book. So we're just trying to just add a little more color to what you've already been reading about. All right. So we're starting off with elevation, which is also known as projection. Now this is actually defined here as well. And you see you have a picture that's depicted here as well to be able to talk about what elevation is. And elevation is important because when you're doing any kind of cuts and the hair is supposed to be cut at a specific elevation, whether it's 0-degree elevation or 45-degree elevation or 90-degree elevation or a long layered style, which is 180-degree elevation. You want to make sure the hair is held relative to from where it grows, as that point says there. As we continue with our terminology, there's some basic ones that are listed here: a part or a parting. Now, one of these points on here that I like in particular is the parting, because it also has another name to it, the subsection, as you see that's listed here as well. Now it says that this is a smaller section of the hair parted from the larger section. Now, when is it that we might see this? Well, if we back up a little bit and we talk about the part, for instance, right? Say, for instance, that you're doing a blunt hairstyle, or a blunt cut, I should say. And typically that haircut is done with four sections or 4 parts. Means that you are taking the hair from just being one long style that doesn't have a part to it, to then crossing those sections and making 4 equal parts. And as you do this demo on your haircut styles and in your competencies in your lab or your clinic, on your lab or clinic floors, what you'll notice is that you're going to do these 4 equal sections to be able to do your cuts. So technically speaking, that means you are parting the hair or sectioning the hair into 4 equal sections. So again, part and section are the same thing. In the very same vein there, we see that the parting or the subsection is the same thing. So just as you will section the hair into 4 parts or 4 sections, you will actually have partings or subsections within each of those parts or within each of those sections. Now you'll see this demonstrated when it comes to not only cutting the hair, but also too, you're going to have to pull subsections or pull partings when it comes to doing relaxer application, where you're pulling a subsection within a section. When you're doing hair coloring, you have to do the same. So you're going to see this word parting. Most people tend to use the word subsection from my experience, but remember, it's really the same thing. Parting and subsection is the same exact thing. It just depends on the terminology that your individual instructor uses, but it means the same thing. You're going to see this as you continue on, and definitely in part 3 of this book, because you're going to be going over the men's haircutting chapter along with women's haircutting, where you're going to be talking about parting and subsections. And also once you get to chemical texture services and hair coloring, we're going to talk more about sections and subsections. Hopefully I didn't confuse you. But ultimately, we're just talking about the same thing when it comes to parting and subsections. We mentioned here the cutting line, the design line. The design line is simply the outer perimeter line of the haircut. Some would call it the lineup. We talk about guide. Now, it says the guide is the cut that's made to which subsequent partings or sections of hair will be measured to cut. Now, when you're creating a guide, this is a very important term as well. This is another one that you should really dig deep into when you're doing your studying for this chapter. When it comes to your guide, when you set that first guide or that first cut, and you're going to have a guide that's going to either be a stationary guide or a traveling guide, which we're going to talk about in a second, that initial guide is what's going to be your guide throughout all of your cuts on that whole hairstyle. So making sure that you keep a consistent guide throughout the whole haircut is going to help with the accuracy of your haircut, to make sure there aren't sections that are cut uneven. Okay? And that's what we're talking about here in our next slide, the stationary guide versus the traveling guide. And we see the differences between the two. All right, you're going to want to be able to understand that if you're using a stationary guide or a traveling guide, and continue to use that same guide throughout the haircut. Okay. Again, many of these different terms that you'll find, and actually I'll go back to that, I'm sorry, before I move to the next one. Many of these different terms that we're discussing, you can't become a barber by just talking about it or just seeing it. You got to actually really see it and feel it and touch it. You have to be able to actually do those cuts. So even though we're going over this um, verbiage and these different terms and so forth, once you're actually on the lab floor and you're actually doing these different cuts and practicing these different things on a model or a mannequin, you're going to start to really see and feel exactly what these terms are talking about. Okay. So we talked about the word taper or tapering. We talked about that a little bit earlier in our last couple of PowerPoints. It also mentions the weight line and texturizing. These are just more terms that are used. As we move to our next one, it talks about tension. Now, why is tension important? When it talks about tension here, it's talking about the amount of tension that's being used or the amount of pressure that's being applied by holding or combing that hair out before you actually do any kind of cut. So you see how now everything is starting to be linked together. If you're going to be doing any kind of haircut where you have to section the hair, for instance, that means that it needs to be sectioned properly, right? That means you have to have the proper elevation to cut it properly. You have to have the proper tension to cut it properly, right? You see how all these things are now starting to come into play. Now, that's for longer hairstyles. At the same time, you might not necessarily have to worry about tension as much with shorter hairstyles, with perhaps clipper cuts. But we see there's still even terminology for that, outlining. We talked about that earlier on before. Just to scroll back to one of our previous ones. We talked about the design line, which is considered perhaps the outer perimeter of the haircut. Now, when we slide down back to outlining, this again is marking the outer perimeter of the front of the haircut, around the ears and down the nape. So again, we see how these terms start to come together. We see here more points that are listed here, more terms, over direction in terms of what that does to the hair or the hairstyle. As we move forward, finger and shear techniques. Finger and shear techniques is something that's typically used what's primarily used whenever you're using shear over comb or finger and shear work. Basically, that means that you're using your comb to go along with your shears to do your cutting work, whether it's typical shears or thinning shears. All right. We see more terminology in terms of cutting above the fingers or below the fingers, which is fairly self-explanatory. When you're holding the hair up with that tension, that elevation, cutting above the fingers, as opposed to cutting below the fingers. Okay. Now we see a picture that's listed here for us in regards to shear cutting techniques. All right. Now this one in particular is cutting palm to palm. Now, as you can see here, this is just an example where there's tension that's being used to pull the hair out, and the hair is being cut at a specific elevation. Now, in terms of doing this kind of haircut or using this kind of technique, we see this cutting palm to palm. We see that he's holding the comb in his hand. He hasn't put the comb down. He's holding the shears properly, and that's the kind of technique that we're looking for. It talks about some other different techniques, whether it's a shear over comb technique, which we briefly discussed earlier on. We also talk about rolling the comb out. And again, this is an example where you're really going to understand this as you start to do these haircuts in the lab. Some more cutting techniques: shear point tapering, being able to thin out specific areas that are perhaps more difficult because of cowlicks or whorls and so forth. Freehand shear cutting, another example. As we move on to we're starting to wind down with this PowerPoint. As we move on to some more of these different techniques, freehand clipper cutting, which is usually something that's done using your clipper with whether it's a magnetic motor or a rotary motor, and for some reason I don't know why I'm forgetting it, but our other motor style, excuse me, that I'm forgetting. But that's typically done where you're going to be freehanding over the top of the head, perhaps for an afro. Clipper over comb cutting, you're definitely going to be using that for your state board test. When you taper the back out on the mannequin, they want to be able to see that you can do the clipper over comb work. No guards. Okay. Arching, this is a technique that can be used to also create a perimeter line on the haircut. And this can be done with a clipper or a trimmer. So you're going to have that demonstrated as well. Razor cutting is something that's listed as well. This is typically done more so when it comes to razor cutting on the hair. It's used to help to thin or texturize the hair. to be able to give it more of a specific, more dynamic look. And this is typically done on more straight hair. As we continue on with more razor cutting techniques, these are more techniques that are used under that same topic when it comes to using our razor. Typically, you will see this done where you're using a guard on your razor to be able to cut. We have more razor stroke techniques that are listed here as well in terms of different types of blending that are listed here. And with that, we're done with part 3. So before we move on, let's ask one of our questions from this chapter. And let's go with, I don't want to ask you that one yet because we haven't gone over it. Okay, let's go with this one. The highest point on the top of the head is the blank. The highest point on the top of the head is the blank. Is it A, horseshoe, B, apex, C, hatband, or D, parietal ridge? And the answer is, you're correct, the apex. So we're going to move on to part number 4 of our chapter for chapter 14, men's haircutting. And we look forward to getting your thoughts in regards to that when we meet in the classroom.